Okay, thank you, Tina, and thank you everyone for being here. So to start, I am very pleased to announce today's speaker, my dear friend and colleague, Ivan Cerovac. So Ivan Cerovac, to say something about him, his work is really vast, so I can say a lot of things, but I'll try to keep it relatively simple and short. So, as I said, Ivan Cerovac, my dear friend and colleague from the University of Rijeka. So, he's a Croatian political philosopher working at the University of Rijeka. His work, as I said, mainly focuses on political philosophy, particularly normative theories of justice, equality, and the legitimacy of political institutions. And he works primarily within the framework of contemporary analytic political philosophy, engaging with debates on distributive justice, egalitarianism, and the justification of social and economic inequalities in liberal democracies. So he also addresses questions of democratic legitimacy, political decision making, including the relationship between expert knowledge and democratic participation, as well as the roles of citizens in complex modern societies. And in this context, he often explores issues in political epistemology and the conditions for informed democratic governance. Ivan has published extensively. So academic articles on topics from political philosophy, the roles as theory of justice, equality of opportunity, democratic equality, and related questions in contemporary normative political theory. And in addition to many journal articles, he has contributed to academic projects and conferences in political philosophy. He is currently a project leader of two projects. Am I right? It's two, right? That more, okay.
Yes, yes, too.
So two projects. Um, and he is an author of two manuscripts, so two books in political philosophy. And he's also very active in promoting and popularizing science through his work in coffee house debates. So, without further ado, I would just like to shortly introduce today's topic. So, Ivan today is going to talk about political polarization and how it's driven by divisive social media, partisan mainstream media, and citizens' echo chambers, which, of course, presents a challenge in today's society. And he is going to. So the title of the today's talk is sorry, I forgot the exact title.
I
So
will share the screen
political,
now
yeah.
to
So
help you a
is a
little bit.
ward against
Sorry, I
because
wanted to
it's
see
a bit
who's here.
it's a mouthful. Yeah. So weak ties as a word against political polarization. So Ivan also extensively works on political polarization, and actually the two of us even have an article coming out on slurs and polarization in a month or so. So you will be able to read it if interested. Without further ado, Ivan, I'm going to give you word. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm sure this will be a pleasant encounter to and a pleasant presentation to listen to.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julia. I hope you can hear me and see the presentation well. And yes, without losing too much time, I would like to go straight to the point. So, the talk I have prepared for today is about political polarization, but not in general. I'm actually comparing the political and social polarization taking place in the American societies and in the European societies. And then trying to map what are the differences for the different forms and different levels of polarization going on the different sides of the Atlantic. Um, to foreshadow my main point, I'm going to claim that it's about the structure of social networks between individual members within a society. And finally, I'm going to argue that the structure of social networks depends, among other things, about some state policies or some policies that the state implements. And I'm going to provide some recommendations with regards to strengthening weak ties in a society and using them as a means, as an instrument to counter political and social polarization. So let me start with just a little bit of an introduction. Political polarization is something that has been well discussed in the past 50, 60 years. There is a lot of discussion on the causes of political polarization, the consequences of political polarization. For example, the paper Julia and I have coming out discusses both the causes and consequences related to hate speech, but there is also a lot of other academic work discussing how, for example, political polarization affects housing policies, how it affects long-term friendships, how it affects one's employability, and so on. So there's a vast research on political polarization. And this actually becomes more and more important as actually the level of tracked political polarization in both European and American societies seems to skyrocket. There is an increasing divergence between partisans when we talk about political and ideological issues. Now, when we talk about political polarization, we primarily talk about an increasing divergence and division of political attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies within a society. Basically, people holding different, but not only different, often incompatible views, and people forming their affective stances towards others, no longer as mere competitors or people who disagree, but as political enemies or people who want to harm the society. And so, while there have been a lot of causes identified throughout the history of this research, which includes partisan politics, news media, social media, echo chambers, and so on, differences in cultural identities, social and economic inequalities, and so on, there is still a lot of disagreement on the exact role and the impact of each of these causes on political polarization. And I'm not going to try to resolve these debates. These are all very important pieces of research. I'm just going to add something additional upon that. Of course, when we talk about the consequences of political polarization, again, we have a lot of research tracking these, including the erosion of trust in political and social institutions, rise of political extremism, a decline in the quality of government or the quality of decisions produced by the government, and the continuous undermining of the civic deliberation and civic friendship, as discussed by many authors. So it is still unclear how serious a threat political polarization really is, and it's still unclear what can we do to remedy its negative effects or to prevent people from becoming politically polarized. Now, this paper tries to demonstrate that weak social ties play an important role in countering political polarization, leading to a weaker polarization in Europe when compared to the US. So that's the main idea. This paper was actually inspired by something that happened during the Sisak and Petrinja earthquake a few years ago, I think 4 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, I'm not sure, I think 5 years ago. A strong earthquake hit some Croatian towns and cities, and there was a lot of stress relief being gathered in different areas around the country. People were donating clothes, food, and so on. And NGOs, like, for example, the Croatian Red Cross, was gathering these supplies. And then an interesting thing happened, and I was witnessing it with my own two eyes. Actually, as I was a volunteer at the Red Cross at that moment, helping gather this food, clothes, and other supplies, the Red Cross shares its headquarters the same building as the Association of Croatian War Veterans from the Homeland War, or from the recent war in the 90s. And this group of people is typically not only leaning towards the right, but they typically endorse a more, not only conservative, but also more like moderate to far right stances towards society, social issues, and so on. On the other hand, people volunteering in Red Cross were quite different, including some girls 17, 18 years old with a lot of piercings, hair that was dyed green, and openly homosexual. And now, these two groups of people would probably never meet in a cafe, in some kind of a social event, and so on. But what happened here is that actually you could see Red Cross volunteers carrying out some really heavy sacks and baskets full of food. And those Croatian War veterans were standing there saying like, okay, they're obviously doing something useful, let's help them. And then there was this heartbreaking moment when you could see a 65-year-old Croatian War veteran carrying some heavy basket or something, along with a 17 or 18-year-old very liberal, very progressive, very gay, very lesbian girl in her 70s or 80s, 80s. And so I was standing there and I said, okay, there is something interesting going on here. And this is actually what motivated or inspired this paper to actually see, are associations like Red Cross, or is the political background culture in Croatia, which includes strong civil society and so on, something that helps prevent polarization? And can we actually differentiate between the levels of polarization in the US and in Europe based on the type of the welfare state or based on the type of the NGO sector they have in these countries? Okay, so this paper has three central theses. The first one is actually that weak social ties counter political polarization. The greater the number of weak social ties, or bridges between citizens per capita, the less pronounced will be the tendency for polarization. That's the first thesis I will try to defend. The second one is that European countries, especially when compared to the US, have higher levels of social capital, social mobility, and interconnectedness, mainly due to the emphasis they put on social cohesion, community-oriented values, similar education opportunities, diverse civil society, and so on. And thus are European countries prone to have more weak social ties per capita than the US. And finally, I noticed that European countries generally exhibit lower levels of political polarization and social polarization. Additionally, even when the level of political polarization in Europe is relatively high, the polarization does not spill over from political to social, cultural, economic spheres as much as it does in the US. So these are the three central theses that I defend and present in this paper. The aspiration is actually to show that if weak social ties reliably reduce polarization, and if polarization is something that needs to be reduced, the government should assess which mechanisms and which type of associations increase the number of weak social ties per capita, and the government should support and promote these mechanisms and these associations in order to reduce political polarization. Of course, this is and this will be a demanding interdisciplinary endeavor requiring expertise from various scientific fields. The presentation I have prepared is made out of four parts. First, I start briefly by discussing what are weak social ties, how they function, and why they're important. In the second part, I will going to talk a little bit about social ties that act as bridges between two different closed social networks. And I will talk about the effects that bridges have on different forms of political polarization. In the third part, I briefly compare polarization, the types of polarization and the levels of polarization in Europe versus those in the US. And finally, I provide some recommendations or how to promote weak ties and thus counter political polarization. So this is the plan for today. Let me start with the first part, with weak social ties, what they are and what is their role. So this is mostly from sociological research and from social sciences. Social ties or social connections, social relationships refer to connections and interconnections that individuals have with others within their social network. Social ties thus encompass various relationships people form with family members, with their friends, colleagues, neighbors, acquaintances, and so on. And what sociologists have developed is a way of measuring the strength of a social tie. Basically, the strength of the social tie is the result of a combination of the amount of time two people spend together, emotional intensity of their relation, the level of intimacy, for example, the type of secrets they share, the type of information they share with each other, and so on, and the degree of reciprocal services. And this is quite old, from 1970s, widely accepted definition of what affects the strength of a social tie. So, for example, you can see, or what I saw earlier, there are people here. For example, I see that Holger Kik is here. I see Julija Perhat here. We have certain social connections or social ties, and the strength of our social ties, so for example, mine and Julia's social tie, or my and Holger's social tie, depends on the amount of time we spend together, the emotional intensity we have, the degree of reciprocal services we have, and so on. And so typically, sociologists differentiate two types of ties, social ties. First are the strong ties, those we form with our parents, with our close friends, with direct family, and so on. We spend a lot of time with them, we get emotionally intense, intimate, we share a lot of reciprocity with them, and so on. And the other type are weak social ties, those we form with our co-workers, school friends, distant relatives, acquaintances, maybe neighbors in a huge building, and so on. The idea is that this type of social ties require less time, they are not that emotionally intense, less intimate, there is less reciprocity, and so on and so on. And this is useful for understanding how people form social connections and so on. But it's also useful for understanding political polarization. Namely, the strength of a social tie between individuals A and B can help us predict other social ties of these individuals. Namely, since strong social ties typically require more time to uphold, but also include some shared values, shared interests, and so on, strong ties tend to create closely knit and closed social networks. People having similar beliefs, spending a lot of time together, having a lot of reciprocal relations, having similar interests, similar hobbies, and so on and so on. And so if there is a strong social tie between individuals A and B, and if there is a strong social tie between individuals A and C, there is a high chance that there is or will be a strong social tie between B and C, because A and B and A and C spend a lot of time together, they have similar interests, they have similar hobbies, they share a lot of reciprocity, and so on. So there is a high chance that at some moment B and C will meet each other, they will already have similar interests, they will already have similar values, and so on. And by spending some time with A, they will actually start spending time with each other. So we can predict social ties between individuals depending on the intensity of social ties. For example, if there is a strong social tie between A and B and between A and C, it is very unlikely that there won't be any tie between individuals B and C. Now, since strong social ties create closed and tightly knit information networks, people spending a lot of time together, people sharing the same background education, background beliefs, values, and so on and so on. The flow of information within such networks is limited only to a small number of members of a network. And so the members of such a network cannot receive new information from outside the network, and the information they have cannot leave the network they are in, because strong social ties tend to produce closed networks. What we need to make the information go out of this closely knit network is actually a bridge, a weak social tie, one that connects a member of one social network with a member of some other social network. The problem is that strong social ties are seldom bridges, because the time invested in the relationship and its intensity and intimacy and reciprocity and so on have a natural tendency to close down the network. Therefore, to improve the transfer of information, we need weak social ties. Those that will not be too demanding, that will not consume too much of our time, that will not ask us a lot of emotional involvement and so on, and will thus enable us to keep the network open. Because while we can have 5, 10, 15 strong social ties, we can have hundreds and hundreds of weak social ties, thus facilitating the flow of information between different closed networks. And you can see it here, for example. This is a very simple illustration. We have two information networks. Both are closed and tightly knit. And what we can see here is, for example, the individual A and this green one here share a bridge, a weak social tie. For example, these are members of two families, and A and the green one here are working in the same workplace environment, or are attending the same school or the same university, and so on and so on. And they sometimes have a coffee together in the cafeteria and so on. So this is actually what enables the transfer and the flow of information from one member of the closed social network to another member of a closed different social network. Of course, to facilitate this flow of information, we need bridges, but not every bridge is equally effective. Information can often be lost if there is too many bridges, or if the information has to travel. There is this game called, in Croatian, it's called gluhi telefon, or deaf telephone would be translated in English, when you whisper something into someone's ear and then it goes on for 20, 30 people, and then it completely changes, the information changes or gets lost somewhere in the process. The same goes with bridges. Bridges are effective when the information does not have to cross over too many bridges to get to its destination. And so not every weak tie is an effective bridge. First, weak ties between members of the same social and cultural group may not be used to transfer a lot of new information. Piketty has a lot about this. However, weak social ties are in general more likely to link members of different small groups than strong social ties, which typically tend to be concentrated within particular closed groups. And now, the important thing, and one of the theses that can be contested, but one of the theses upon which this paper relies, is actually the idea that how many weak ties an average citizen will have, as well as whether these ties will be diverse and thus constitute effective bridges, depends not only on the individuals, but also on the government's policies and the way how society is organized. So the way how we frame our social, economic, and other policies, cultural policy, and identity policy, educational policies, and so on, affects the number of bridges per capita in a certain society. Okay, now after that, I move towards political polarization. First, briefly to introduce what political polarization is, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this because this is not a paper about polarization. When we talk about political polarization, typically, political theorists and social epistemologists distinguish between two main types: ideological polarization, going on the values axis. Basically, different groups within society start having different worldviews, different values, different political ideas, and so on. And these values and ideas become more and more apart and more incompatible. We can track this type of polarization by looking, for example, at the policies or the manifestos or even the ideologies between opposing political parties, and we can track it by following the rhetorics used in the political sphere. For example, how different president candidates addressed each other and so on. On the other hand, affective polarization measures the emotional and the affective stance citizens have towards those who do not share the same beliefs or are not the members of the same group as they are. In this regard, we try to focus and to assess how do partisans or politically engaged citizens see their political opponents? Do they see them as like benevolent people just having different ideas on how to make society better? Or do they see them as corrupt, manipulative, stupid, and so on? Most of the research shows that both types of polarization are now growing, both in the UK, in the Europe, but in the UK as well, and in the US. The thing is, these different types of polarization will have different effects on the way how society is organized, but in both cases, it will have negative effects on political deliberation. And now, what does this have to do with social ties and social networks? Well, as we already determined, weak social ties, and in particular bridges, increase information flow, including the exposure to ideologically diverse views. The more bridges there are in a society, the more members of this society will be exposed to different worldviews, different ideas, different values, and so on. Namely, as Cass Sunstein famously argues, enclave, closed deliberation typically takes place in closed social networks, which are predominantly made out of strong social ties. Or, for example, weak ties that are not effective bridges, because they are made between the members of the same social group, between the members of the same elite, and so on. So, closed enclave deliberation leads to group polarization, which in turn represents a breeding ground for extremism and endanges social stability. And of course, there is a lot of biases, a lot of research in behavioral psychology and so on, which explains what is going on with group deliberation, group polarization, and so on, and how different cognitive biases facilitate enclave deliberation. Empirical research shows that this is just part of the story. The other, maybe even more important part, focuses on citizens' tendency to intentionally, not a bias, cognitive bias, something we do unintentionally by accident and so on. A lot of this is going on by citizens' tendency to intentionally exclude other perspectives. And this tendency is often taught or motivated by social norms that constitute the so-called crippled epistemology. Social norms that basically say that there is nothing useful you can gain from communication with those people who hold different views or different values or who belong to a different social group. And there are some famous examples of this. I think the next slide shows some of them here. Democrats in the US have this famous book. You can't see it that well, but it says lies and lying liars who tell them. A fair and balanced look to the right. So basically the idea is, let's call our political opponents lying liars. Or some other, like Moore calls them a stupid white man. The idea is, why would I spend some time communicating with someone who is a lying liar? Or what kind of a useful information can I get from a stupid white man? And so on. Basically, the rhetoric that is being made, and this is what constitutes crippled epistemology, is the rhetorics made to disregard the testimony of certain groups of people based on their ideological or group identity. Similarly, if we look at the right, Republicans are not falling behind. There's this famous book by Ann Coulter, How to Talk to a Liberal If You Must. Basically, the idea is don't talk to a liberal. There's nothing you can gain from talking to a liberal. But if you really must, this book will show you, it will explain to you how not to get trapped, how to make the conversation meaningless so you don't get trapped into their progressive ideologies and so on and so on. So basically, we see that society actually developed communication norms that facilitate polarization by cutting the bridges. When you read this book, you actually become motivated to cut the bridges you have, the weak social ties, with some Republicans who are your friends or your acquaintances, because why would you hang around with stupid white men or with lying liars? And vice versa. So, as we know, cross-cutting interactions facilitate the flow of information, they prevent enclave deliberation and the resulting polarization, and they foster political moderation, and there is a lot of empirical research showing this. Cross-cutting interactions also prevent affective polarization by promoting empathy, understanding, perspective-taking, upholding civic friendship, and so on. So first, we saw what are weak social ties. And second, we saw why weak social ties are important for countering political polarization. Namely, because unlike strong social ties, which create closely knit social networks, weak social ties acting as bridges facilitate the flow of information. And now let's come to the comparison between the situation in the US and in Europe. First of all, it would be very wrong to blame the situation and the rising polarization in US solely on the social structure, weak social ties, and so on. A lot of causes are, of course, related to the two-party system existing in the US. And you can see here just some of the research showing and demonstrating that the two-party system increases political polarization more prominently than multi-party system. However, the reasons for greater political polarization and social polarization in the US can also be traced to the structure of social networks in the US society. Namely, in the US, liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans, make both strong and weak social ties primarily within their own separate communities. And there is a lot of research supporting this. PEW Research Center from the US tracked, for example, how willing are people to marry or to endorse marriage with someone holding different political views. And I think you can see it here. For example, you can see, for example, that both Republicans and Democrats claim that to a certain degree, they would be unhappy if a family member married outside of the party. Basically, a substantial number of both Democrats and Republicans argue that they would not like it, they would hate it if their brother, sister, child, and so on married to someone holding different political views or voting or being a registered voter for a different opposing political party. And here you can see another one. This is focused only on conservatives, showing that most conservatives say close friends share their political views. So people tend to get surrounded by people who hold the same ideas, the same views, the same sentiments as they do. This goes further when we talk about personal space. Here you can see that For example, there is a substantial number of Republicans and Democrats saying that most of their close friends share their political views. Or, for example, saying that it is important for them to live in a place where most people share their political views, to live in a red neighborhood or in a blue neighborhood, and so on. And of course, the one we discussed earlier, that some of them would be unhappy if someone inside their immediate family married outside the party. And this is also discussed in two wonderful books that I would recommend everyone to read. Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam and Bill Bishop's The Big Sword. Both are actually books in sociology and social sciences trying to determine what is going on in the American society for the past 30, 40 years. And actually how people are getting alienated from their neighbors, or how people are starting to create neighborhoods that are consistently filled with people holding very similar or identical political views to their own. But that's not all. Social conditions also affect the creation of social networks. For example, inequalities in income and wealth, and of course, different types of social state or welfare state in Europe and in the US affect the quality of education, healthcare, and other relevant social services. For example, if you have a private education system, as you have in the US, people or students will be classified by their income in better schools, average schools, lower quality schools, and so on. And in many cases, the schools will be actually funded by the taxes they pay. So we will have good schools in high quality neighborhoods when people of certain economic and political profile live, and so on, which actually means that there will be a smaller amount of effective bridges between students in such homogeneous environments. Also, there is a research indicating that there is an aggregate decline in membership of traditional civic organizations, those that tend to catch all, both Republicans and Democrats as their members. Red Cross could be one good example, but many others, they have a declining membership. And nowadays, more and more citizens are tending to choose neighborhood, NGOs, media, and so on, compatible with their lifestyle and their beliefs. And just some examples. While in Croatia, you typically, or in most European countries, you typically have NGOs that are thematically focused. This is a green NGO. This is a professional association of physical, of engineers, or professional association of doctors, or this is an association of people liking science and science fiction and so on. In the US society, we actually have parallel worlds. For example, if we talk about environmental protection, there are conservative and liberal NGOs. Conservative NGOs, like, for example, American Energy Alliance, discussing and talking about environmental protection, but gathering predominantly or mostly Republicans. And Greenpeace, for example, also famous, talking about protecting the environment, climate change, and so on, but most of its members being liberal Democrats. The same goes for healthcare. The famous Cato Institute is a professional association of medical doctors who share conservative views, who vote for Republicans, and so on. But there is an association called Physicians for the National Health Program, which is a liberal NGO, where the doctors are Democrats and vote for the Democratic Party. So this is typical for the US. And while we can see similar trends in Europe, the ideological divide does not spill over as much as it does in the US. In Croatia, for example, I think it's mostly about family issues. And for example, the conservative view of the family, or the inclusive LGBTQ plus friendly view of the family, and so on. But on most other issues, we don't have the ideological divide. And I think the same goes with most European countries. So in 25 European democracies, while there is strong affective polarization among political partisans on political issues, so people often say, oh, I would never go to have a coffee with someone who is voting for Croatian Democratic Union or something like that. The thing is, this divide does not spill over to other social and cultural issues, because in European countries, there are no, or the amount of ideologically divided NGOs, ideologically divided coffee shops, ideologically divided institutions, and so on, pales in comparison to the US. So this implies that European politics is far more polarized than European societies. Basically, the political polarization fails, luckily, to spill over from politics to other social structures. And social cohesion is not as threatened as it is in the US. And finally, the last 3 or 4 minutes to wrap up some recommendations how to promote weak social ties and thus counter political polarization, or what is Europe doing right and what should we keep doing right. These are very general philosophical recommendations, not like policy recommendations and so on. But in general, first, it seems that Europe should continue funding organizations and services that promote weak social ties, and those that increase exposure of different people to different perspectives. This is basically civil society, different NGOs, and so on, which can gather people holding different political views, different ideological views, and so on, based on some common aim or common goal. Let's say an association that focuses on science fiction and fantasy might have people holding conservative and liberal views, but they both like reading Tolkien or J.K. Rowling and so on. And basically, this is what gets them talking and that gets the information flowing. Or, I don't know, in some small village in Croatia, you can have a hunter society, those going around hunter animals and so on. And since they might hold, in most cases, they will hold different political views, but they still spend a lot of time together preparing the food for the animals, taking care of the environment and so on. They will exchange ideas. They will see that they are not devils and so on. A common example from ancient times is syssitia, which used to be a common meal in ancient Greece paid for by the state. Citizens in these ancient times would, regardless of their social status, because the state is paying for the food, come together to share a meal. And in ancient Greece, it was considered a means of fostering social cohesion and reinforcing the sense of community. And I think we have not the same thing, but something similar today with our welfare state founding NGOs, fighting civil sector, fighting different type of associations which are social and not political associations, because they enable people of different worldviews coming in together, not literally sharing a meal, but sharing their time together for some common goal. Or some good other examples might be Erasmus Plus programs, which bring together, which are free for the participants, and which bring together people of different backgrounds, people of from different countries, different parts of countries, different social groups, and so on. A good example is, could be Erasmus Youth Exchange, which does not require participants being from the university or being students or being enrolled in the university. Anyone between 16 and 30 can go for an Erasmus Youth Exchange and so on, meet other people who are attending university, who are attending vocational schools, who are working in the fields, people with different types of problems and so on, and to learn something and communicate and share information with them. And second very general recommendation is actually emphasizing through such associations and services the shared values, common history, and promoting inclusion and participation towards a shared goal. A good example of this was the thing that motivated me towards this paper, the humanitarian type of action going on in the Croatian Red Cross. So there was a shared and common goal. The participants there wanted to help some people who lost their houses in an earthquake and so on and so on. And this is actually what brought together the far-right 65-year-old Croatian war veteran and extremely progressive LGBTQ plus 18-year-old girl with green hair. So things like disaster relief, homelessness and poverty relief, environmental conservation, and so on are some of the topics that can get people together and enable the flow of information and the creation of bridges which are needed to counter political polarization. And my last slide to sum up what I've talked about. Let's recall the three theses I wanted to defend through this paper. The first one is that weak social ties counter political polarization. The greater the number of weak social ties or bridges between citizens per capita, the less pronounced the tendency for polarization. The second thesis is that European countries, compared to the US, have higher level of social capital, mobility, and so on, and are thus prone to have more weak social ties per capita. And finally, European countries generally exhibit lower levels of political polarization, and this political polarization tends not to spill over from the political sphere to social, cultural, and economic spheres as much as it does in the US. So what I have tried to show is I have tried to explain the mechanisms for this correlation, because from 1, 2, and 3, we cannot, from this I have said so far, strongly claim that there is a causality. We just see a correlation, and by using the type of welfare state and its effects on the number of social ties, I have tried to demonstrate that we can think about some forms of causality between these theses. And that's all from me for now, and I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, and everything else.
Thank you, Ivan, for this wonderful talk. It was really informative, really, thank you. Okay, so I am going to open the floor for questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Virtually, of course. Okay, so maybe while we wait for questions, or maybe people want to think about what they've heard, maybe I can start with something. So, of course, I wanted to ask you: are there any recommendations that can promote weak social ties and thus limit polarization or decrease polarization? So you already talked about that. What I would like to maybe ask is, did you maybe do any research about what, or is there any research that you know of about the online environments and whether the same would apply to online environments? Because as we know, so there are numerous situations in real life. For example, you're a coworker, so you're working with somebody in a company and so on. You get in touch with different worldviews and so on. However, in online environments, I think that would be a bit harder. And as we know, communication today, a lot of communication today revolves around online in online environments. And we know that echo chambers are something that people tend to form quite often, and I think that they are pretty good at promoting polarization. So do you have any thoughts on that? Does your research maybe expand to online environments, or is there anything you can add to that?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, of course, a lot of polarization is going on online, and uh, a lot of scholars actually argue that the rising polarization we see nowadays is the result of the information flow going on through actually digital networks, which are shaped by the algorithms that tend to rely on our cognitive biases or to even improve our cognitive biases, making us receive the information we already have shown preference for, or filtering out the information that we did not show interest for, basically shaping what we see in our digital environment. So yeah, that's absolutely an important part when we talk about polarization. Now, when it comes, we can counter polarization, or at least these mechanisms that lead towards polarization, in several different ways. One way can be actually to take this, I would say, like a positive approach, in which you are trying to get people of different backgrounds together. The other, let's say, a negative approach is the one, and I'm not saying that's as a value good or bad, I'm just saying a negative approach is the one in which you are trying to break up or destroy, dissolve homogeneous groups. And now that can be giving the state the authority to do that, and the means to do that can be quite dangerous. Like it can lead to totalitarianism and so on. So I would be very skeptical about saying that the state should go around preventing people from joining. I mean, one of the basic human rights is freedom of association and so on. So I would be very skeptical and very against the idea of the state actually going out and breaking homogeneous groups. But what the state can do is actually to make it harder to to make to make them less prone to occurring spontaneously, or to make them less prone to being produced by someone else's manipulation. And a good example of that can be digital algorithms, for example. So a lot of homogeneous online groups are actually created through recommender systems, algorithms, and so on, which track the former choices a user has made, matching him with a similar type of information, with a similar type of users, and so on. And of course, that's something been going on for at least 15, probably 20 years. And now the thing is, what the state can do is actually limit the type of information and the amount of information the companies gather about the individuals. I cannot make a good algorithm that will, mix you with other people holding the similar ideas as you have, if I don't know what your ideas are, if I'm not allowed to store information about your past internet behavior and so on and so on. And when it comes to, I don't know, GDPR, but also this more recent, like 1 year or 2 years ago, AI Act by European Commission and so on, they are going in that direction. They're actually trying to limit the amount of information companies can legally gather about their users. And when you lack the information, you cannot make a reliable recommender system. So in many cases, the state is not here to actively destroy closely knit networks, because that would be totalitarian and really problematic. But what it can do is it can hamper the creation of such closely knit networks online by disallowing companies from gathering some information, data, past browsing experience, and so on, in order to protect the society from excessive polarization.
Okay, thank you so much for such an informative answer. Yeah, because I think that in the real world, right, it's probably easier to promote such weak social ties through some institutional projects or through NGOs or everything you mentioned. Of course, then there are, I think that the thing you mentioned at the beginning was a crisis, right? So I feel that mostly people come together from different parts of society when there is a crisis. And then again, you don't want to have a crisis like an earthquake or something to promote weak social ties. But I think that definitely policymakers should, if that is the case, that they should definitely work on some kinds of institutional measures to promote weak social ties.
Mhm.
Okay, so are there any questions now that maybe you've gotten a chance to think about it? Yes, so I see Yusuf and then Sasha. So Yusuf, you can go first.
Maybe better if Sasha go first.
Okay, you want Sasha? Okay, then Sasha.
Yeah.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm a little puzzled by your hypothesis that the government should or could promote weak links, because per definition, political parties are enclaves, and therefore also governments, and we see it every day, not only in Croatia, have the tendency to promote whenever this is very utilitarian for them, polarizations in order to enforce their enclave and therefore their
Mhm.
power. So I think it's quite idealistic to think that they would give up this leverage in order to promote something which obviously is socially very desirable, but which could undermine their raison d'être.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you so much. Let me just see if I see it here. Okay. Uh, yeah, absolutely. Brennan. Uh, my thesis was a thesis from political philosophy, normative branch, basically saying governments should promote with social ties. Of course, I was not saying anything about how likely that is. Um, and nowadays it grows to be less and less likely to happen. There is a great book. I'm trying to find it here on my shelf, but I can't see it from here. Here it is. It's called Against Democracy by Jason Brennan. And Brennan has a very interesting thing. He says, like, there are, of course, very, very rudimentally, he says there are three types of citizens in democracy. The first type, he calls it like hobbits, like from Lord of the Rings. They live their own private lives. They don't care about politics. They are politically distant. They don't know anything about politics. They don't care about politics. The other group, he calls them hooligans. And basically, they are those who have strong opinions about politics. They care about politics, but they are biased and they lack proper information. And the third one he calls Vulcans, like from Star Trek, Vulcans. They are those who are engaged in politics, they are interested in politics, and they are not biased. They have a lot of knowledge, they're experts, and so on and so on. And now, uh, what Brennan is actually saying is most political philosophers who do normative theories have this aspiration. Democracy, government, education, and so on should strive to turn hobbits into Vulcans. But what actually happens is that we have hobbits turned into hooligans. Because, of course, if you are a party in power, but if you are a party in opposition, it doesn't really matter. You want your supporters to be biased in your favor, not to talk to liberals or conservatives unless they really must, and so on and so on. So, the party system here is not really helping us resolve the problem. Nonetheless, it's on the other hand, it seems, especially when we look at the recent research on the consequences of political polarization, it seems that the problem is growing. That we are losing social cohesion all the way to, I mean, we are not there yet, or hopefully will never be, but there are like films in US about the next civil war and so on and so on, which turns out to be not like a real, but there is we are thinking about that possibility. And I think that at some moment the political parties should actually start realizing the problems that polarization is causing and looking for other ways how to mitigate polarization. But the problem is, as you mentioned, the same as with climate change. You should realize that there is something going on, but no one actually wants to be the first who will lose his or her supporters by doing something useful about that. So yeah, it's in the end, it turns out to be a very serious problem that's very difficult to resolve. And that's why I said in the first or the second slide that it requires a very interdisciplinary team of people working on this because it's extremely demanding. And I'm providing here just the normative part, basically the justification why it should be done. And unfortunately, I'm not sure, first, how it should be done, and second, how to pursue other people who are in position of power to actually do it.
Thank you, Ivan, for this answer. If I can chip in just really quickly, I think that, I mean, you did mention NGOs, right? So I think that would be definitely one of the maybe most useful ways because, as Sasha said, the government perhaps isn't so inclined to be involved in this, but maybe the NGOs are definitely a way to go.
Mhm.
And
If I may, this is, I think, the main problem that's going on in Europe now is that actually the governments are starting to shape their policies towards NGOs based on the values, the identities, and so on of the NGOs themselves. So when you have a left party in power, some NGOs get more money, more funding, some are cut out of the budget. When you have the right party in power, you have conservative NGOs getting funding and so on, which results into, and it results with actually people considering some NGOs as being right, as being like politically aligned. And in many cases, they are politically aligned, but in this case, they're actually becoming party aligned or partisanship aligned, which in the end results with, of course, I'm not going to go into a NGO that is conservative and far right, for example, which means that NGO will fail to fulfill its duty as a conductor of a weak social ties or bridges, because only members of the far right party will be members of that NGO. I will be a member of other NGO, which is like, let's say, progressive, but then this NGO will fail to provide me with bridges because other people around me will be progressive. And I think we need to find a way how to answer to this problem. One way is having something like not having ministries or policymakers directly or politicians directly funding NGOs by having something like, Croatian Science Foundation for Science, Croatian Nacionalna zaklada za razvoj civilnog društva, so the National Foundation for the Development of Civil Society, which are then, the members of their boards are elected by the parliament and so on, so they are political in a way, but their main intention behind creating such actually bodies is to create a buffer between the government itself and the NGO or government and research institutions and so on.
okay, thank you, Ivan. We have Yusuf now with the question. Yusuf, go.
Okay. Let me introduce very briefly myself. I'm from Turkey. I came to University of Rijeka with Erasmus program for 1 week personal exchange program. And my major is international relations, or IR, very briefly. And my study fields are AI influence on international relations or international system, and migration and border politics, very briefly. And when you came from Slovenia, from Ljubljana, I saw it. So was Zizek. We were talked with many times in our theory classes during PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is that your argument frames the European welfare state as a structural basis for weak ties, but there's a growing literature on welfare nationalism. Adam Borg, Krestev, and Linda Cook recently write a book, and I made a book review of this book, arguing that the same welfare state also produced exclusional belonging regimes, weak ties inside and hard borders outside. So my question is, do weak ties really reduce polarization, or do they just displace it onto the migrant and outsider? I mean, here, where do you put the migrants in your thesis? This is my question, actually.
Wonderful question. And first a good one, and second a dangerous one for me, in a way that when I was thinking about this, I was and this is a typical trap for political philosophers who don't focus on international relations. It's always like we have a society, a state, and there is nothing, like it's the ocean is around it and there is nothing around, and we are talking how to organize what are the rights of the citizens and so on and so on. And yeah, it's a great question to ask. What about the welfare state actually closing, uh, uh, being closely tied and the closed network towards those coming from the outside, like immigration, non-citizens, and so on and so on. So yeah, I definitely did not address that in my talk, because the talk relies on this part of political philosophy focusing on legitimacy within one state or the decision making within one state and so on. But to try to answer it nonetheless, uh, I'm not sure. I mean, of course, different European countries have different types of welfare state and so on and so on, and different border policies, immigration policies, and so on. But I'm not that sure, especially nowadays, that when compared to the US, EU is more closed with regards to immigration than the US. It seems to me that the welfare state in the European countries is more prone to allow immigration, especially immigration for humanitarian reasons and so on and so on. So that is one way of answering it. And exclusion. I'm reading my notes and trying to remember what this meant. Aha, okay. And yeah, and the second one is actually what to do in these cases. Well, a problem can be if we focus on shared values or shared identities. For example, we can have a problem because shared identities is not something that can be easily established. If you have people coming from different countries all around the world, they don't share the same identity, maybe not the same language, not the same culture, and so on and so on. So what would be the way forward? My guess is that in these cases, you need to focus on common aims that transcend cultural identity and so on and so on. Like, for example, I mean, there are often cases, and you read about that in the media, something happens in, I don't know, let's say in some country in Europe or in some country in Middle East or anywhere else, and then other countries start organizing humanitarian projects, sending disaster relief, and so on and so on. So basically, the idea is we can have different cultures, different languages, different things, and so on, but still have a common goal. I think that in many cases, for example, I'm not sure like you and I, but for example, Julia and I definitely. I know Holger from Estonia. I know I met him on 3 or 4 occasions. So I know that I have more in common with Holger than with a Croatian war veteran, for example, when it comes to the same values, the same interests, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, I still share some common things with, for example, far right in Croatia, which is basically the idea that poverty is something bad. Or, for example, that human suffering is something bad, and so on. And then we can organize the type of activities that are based upon these common aims and shared values that are not culture oriented, that actually have something in common with basically all people or most, at least most Western countries, Western plus countries, in a way that, like, yeah, basic human values like well-being, compassion, and so on and so on, which of course will be implemented in different ways in different cultures and so on and so on. But still, their main content remains the same. This is why we have humanitarian relief actions in different countries, different cultures for the same reason.
Okay, thank you. All right, so if there are no more questions or comments, Okay, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today, and especially Ivan for this inspiring and very informative talk. And as I said, thank you all for being here, and especially Ivan. So once more, a virtual clap.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan, very much. And see you next week.
You see other people next week. We don't see each other. Or do we have something planned?
No, we don't see each
Okay,
other. But you
because I
can
was
join
like,
us.
is there a meeting? I forgot something.
You can.
For
Okay,
the rest of
excellent.
us, yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Have a
and
nice
thank you for
day.
the questions and comments.